Bitcoin's sidechains looks like they're finally starting to get some traction. There's been a camp within the Bitcoin community, most notably has been fighting against inscriptions and ordinals and all kinds of things they deem to be spam. But the things that enabled all of that to occur in the first place are the other things that keep us from not having Bitcoin be completely ossified. So it's a very interesting development to see Luke Dasher Jr. starting to talk about side chains and not ossifying Bitcoin. I think this is a pretty momentous notice from Luke on Twitter. Let's talk about this in a bit more detail. Lucas, I know we've talked about the Great Script Restoration, we've talked about sidechains, we've talked about Arch Network. What do you think of reading through this tweet from Luke?
Well, I think we agree, and the reason that we talk so much about the sidechains with Bitcoin, I think we agree that it is imperative for Bitcoin's successful future that they begin to adopt one of these avenues towards more complexity, the ability to become a blockchain that is recording more information, more complex information in the future. I was not. I've been wary about the whether or not the Bitcoin community will come to agreement on which avenue to take in the future. However, with the likes of Luke Jr. turning towards toward a positive step towards adopting something like the great script restoration for Bitcoin, I think this is a very good step. I know he has a large voice in the Bitcoin community, and I think it's going to take members of Bitcoin, respected members of the Bitcoin community, turning towards one of these avenues for that move to come to Bitcoin, that movement to come to Bitcoin.
I think that this is maybe one of the most profound ways to start this whole thing off. Is Bitcoin is not a finished product. This right here is something you and I have discussed in the past, that just because there's some issue with Bitcoin, just because Bitcoin exists in a certain form today, doesn't mean that's the form that it's going to have in the future. Anything from trailing emissions to the actual script that's enabled on the chain to how the consensus mechanism fundamentally works. Any of these things can potentially be changed. So to see somebody like Luke, who has led this sort of Bitcoin doesn't need to change, it doesn't need to have this other stuff in here. I feel like he's turned to a different way of thinking. And I don't know exactly how he came around on this, but he has been the developer who made his own node with a mempool policy intended on eliminating spam from the chain. So ordinals and inscriptions, putting the JPEGs on chain. This was something he viewed as spam and something that should be fought against. But that same sort of mechanisms of where you're putting other types of data on the chain is exactly what CTV and side chains and all the rest of this stuff that BitVM wants to do. All of that kind of stuff, it looks like spam from a different perspective. It's not canonically Bitcoin transactions. It's not just moving coins around. It isn't just financial stuff. It's enabling very complex software infrastructure to be layered on top of Bitcoin. And this is the kind of thing that could bring a decentralized identity style technology to Bitcoin. There's nothing stopping something from what Julia just did is being launched on something like Bitcoin if Bitcoin had sufficient complexity. So it's been lacking in that direction. So it's interesting to see Luke, who is leading the charge of all of this stuff is spam and should be filtered out, now to there is some of this traffic which should be on the chain. And if we have more broad adoption for this type of stuff on Bitcoin, that should drive more utilization of the chain, more demand for block space. That should entrench Bitcoin as one of the substantive players in the ecosystem.
I think the real question that that interests me at this point, because we've had the discussions about what the future of Bitcoin looks like, but the real question here is why has such a why has a leader in the drive to keep Bitcoin simple, maybe in another way to put it, to keep Bitcoin held as a financial asset rather than a currency. I don't want to start any fights there, but that has been the result of his positions in the past. Why is he making this switch now? Have you seen any other rationale coming from Luke Jr., or is this the first that you've seen of his pivot?
This is the first I've seen. I try to keep track of what he's saying on his account. I think he represents a significant camp within Bitcoin. You know, he was running knots. Like there were several pools that were running this particular flavor variant of Bitcoin that had the mempool policy in it. And so he does have some representation. He does have some amount of people that are listening to what he says, following his tech, and running software that he is leading the charge on. So he does represent a camp within Bitcoin. I hadn't seen anything like this previously. It could be that I took my eye off the ball and he's been talking about this for some time, but this, when he said this particularly, it stuck out that this was a sea change in his thinking process. And you know, it's not that we don't have other people that are calling for this kind of a thing, but it almost feels like this camp has flipped. And unless everybody else that used to represent this viewpoint just remains behind and it's only Luke that's come across, it may be that we're reaching towards consensus. So I hadn't seen anything else. This is the one that stuck out.
Given his position as a contributor to Bitcoin's code, to the writer of a widely used node for Bitcoin, I have to wonder if the reason for his change in what he wants to see with Bitcoin has to do um, with the adoption by Bitcoin by the likes of companies like MicroStrategy, by governments who are opting to hold it as a reserve asset. And I say that because if they are satisfied with Bitcoin as it is, and they want to keep it frozen and not as a public ledger that needs to accommodate lots of transactions of people moving things back and forth, but want to hold it as reserves. But I don't know if you saw Kazakhstan. I haven't mentioned this, but Kazakhstan opted this morning to buy Bitcoin to hold as a reserve asset, and a member of the BRICS consortium, south of Russia. But if that's the case in the future for Bitcoin, then I don't know that they have, or there will be a need for a character like Luke Jr. to be involved in that ecosystem. So I have to wonder if his pivot or his evolution, to take a word from Obama, has to do with an understanding of where the future of Bitcoin is currently headed.
Where it heads, yeah, it's an interesting question whether this reserve asset business really makes Bitcoin be the right thing, or whether it causes its slow death. I think there's a lot of people who want to see Bitcoin as a technology continuously used. It is certainly something that Michael Saylor talked a lot about how powerful of a platform it is to do a variety of different things. And it's also been canonically put together in, this famous horrible paper that everybody points to and no one seems to have read, which is Software, that Bitcoin enables for a new kind of power projection mechanism. But it only really can do that if it's a technology platform and not just some asset that sits on the ledgers of various big banks and central banks, and they're just occasionally moving money from one side to the other to reconcile ledgers. I don't think that that's a powerful enough incarnation of Bitcoin for it to be a power projection technology. So if it's going to be something like that, then what we're talking about with Luke, and I think this is likely what's turning people's minds away from this, is starting to think about what does ossification really mean, and does it take Bitcoin out of the hands of the people that they want it to be in. I think it substantively does. That I would anticipate that would be why the turning of the tide, why people would start to turn towards this idea, because having Bitcoin infrequently used by central banks looks just as bad as, Bitcoin itself dying or going away. So it's either it continues to be relevant, continues to be a technology platform on which things can be built, or it doesn't succeed in the longer term. So I'd imagine that's probably why we're seeing this change.
I probably ought not to lump MicroStrategy in with central banks and financial institutions. That's a good point there. There could also be, the likes of ETH hitting an all-time high and the broader adoption of crypto causing concern amongst the Bitcoin community as to being, surpassed by a lesser, in regards to consensus security chain, rise up in prominence because there are, more viable technical aspects of that chain that are available for use as people begin to think about what the possibilities for public blockchains bring into the world. I say ETH, also
Well,
Chia.
it's with side chains like this running on top of Bitcoin, and with some limited or even more substantive expansion of the script available to Bitcoin, and a lot of the criticisms of Bitcoin suddenly go away. One of the things that is said about Bitcoin is it's slow and it can't scale. Side chains are intended to directly combat that, to allow for scalability outside of what the main chain can do. And if that means that the main chain has a lot of value in its block space, and that the main token for that chain has a lot of value as a reserve asset, that starts to look like the best of all possible worlds. It's one of the problems with ETH right now is a lot of the L2s were driving a substantive amount of the value, and there wasn't really a lot going on the main chain, which was causing the main token's price to drop, and was starting to look like a security concern for ETH, with it ripping back to all-time high. That doesn't seem to be the case, but it's always a problem if your side chains scale harder, faster, bigger, and then there isn't as much demand for the token on the main chain. So if Bitcoin, as already being a very desirable L1 token for store of value, it becomes very obvious that this could be a really substantive chain to build on top of if you don't need to use the blockchain space on the L1 too frequently. That keeps your costs relatively low, but gives you all the main security of the main chain itself. So, if the side chains are enabled on Bitcoin, I'd say that could be a very bad thing for other chains that have been thriving because of Bitcoin's lack of being able to compete in the same space. And I look directly at Solana, maybe, rather than at ETH for this type of activity.
You know, sidechains have been attempted on Bitcoin. Do you think that this is also in part an acknowledgement of the failure of those sidechains in the current with the current Bitcoin script possibilities?
Well, I mean, the attempts at side chains on Bitcoin have been difficult at best. I'd say it's hard to do a side chain well because of the way that Bitcoin's currently structured with its scripting. So without certain things, and Luke speaks directly to this, like, what do we need to do to get functioning side chains on here? He kind of alludes to some of the Bitcoin improvement protocols that have been proposed. So BIP 300 is a main one that people have been looking at in the side chain world for a while. And some of these, what he's calling low risk soft forks, consensus cleanups, things that can be done to make Bitcoin able to do these things much better, because we've been doing really weird workarounds. So BitVM is a way to do things because of its lack of scripting. So we're missing an operator, or we're missing some particular math function on Bitcoin. And so instead of going and begging the community to add it via a soft fork, BitVM said, well, we can implement it inside of Boolean logic. And if we do this hard work to make this enabled, then we can make it work and we can sort of shoehorn it in so we can keep going without having to wait for this. So some of that stuff that went on, and some of these things that have been built to try to make these things work, it's because it's so convoluted. So making some changes to Bitcoin and saying that it isn't done, it's not ossified, there are things that can be added in, just the same way that SegWit was added in previously, makes it so that these sidechain developments can actually move forward in earnest. Because I think so far they've all been academic sort of investigations into what could be possible and how it might actually work. They're laying the groundwork for what will come when we actually get some of these things adopted. And then I think what you're going to see is an explosion of this stuff as if it came out of nowhere, because it's been developed in the background for so long. And so we're kind of missing this connector piece. Once we have that connector piece in place on the main chain, all of these things are going to be able to be launched in a more substantive way. Then we're going to start to see the ability of Bitcoin to compete with Solana in the same high TPS activity that's been going on there, with reconciliation back to the main chain with some periodic spends on the Bitcoin main network. I expect that's how this is going to play out. So I don't think we've really seen side chains really come into the ecosystem because it was so hard to actually make it work, and it wasn't obvious that it was ever going to go in the right direction that could make those difficult things go away, and whether they actually would have hindered the real adoption of it, or if they would have hindered the true security of those things in the longer term.
So if the, maybe I should call it the never ordinals crowd that Luke Jr. represents, you know, their broad viewpoint, if it changes, what do you see is the most likely avenue forward? Is it the Great Script Restoration? Does that seem to be the right sort of reliance on the current structure of Bitcoin with just the right additions to operators?
It feels like the right thing to do, in my opinion. I don't think Luke is getting into that camp. I don't think he's backing it in that way, or else he would have mentioned it by name, particularly here. Like, if there was ever an opportunity to really give a nod towards the work that's already been done by this camp, he didn't. And so I think he's looking at it as a thinner version of that, some difference. So if we look at the Great Script Restoration as getting to Turing completeness on Bitcoin, that being like the far right of the spectrum, he's somewhere to the left of it. I don't think he really is supporting it at all. He's more looking at this judiciously and saying there's some very specific things that I can now get behind, and I only want to go as far as is necessary, rather than let's jump to Turing completeness and make it so that anything can be done on Bitcoin. I think that's kind of his approach, is let's still try to find some small incremental steps that we can make that enable more things, but do it as slow as possible. So I would still say Luke is maybe moved out of the ossification camp, not onto the freeway, but into this slow moving mud river that slog through one step at a time. That seems like he's taken, one step to the right, but not really gotten into the fast lane, which is what, the Great Script Restoration.
I have to wonder, once he abandons ossification, and others who have also been in that camp, once they begin to think about Bitcoin in a different light, I wonder how quickly they make those steps further and further to the right until they wind up into this Turing completeness. It would seem to me that the logical progression is, once you say, oh, we do need this to be a capable public database with a wonderful decentralized security mechanism. Once they go down that road, it would seem to me that they wind up in something that looks like the script restoration rather than these baby steps.
Did you note that he even mentions consensus in here?
I thought that he did.
Well, I'm mentioning it because this is part of what I think might need to occur here, and I've mentioned it before. Some of the vulnerabilities that have been pointed out on Bitcoin, some of the things that we're all starting to get nervous about with what just happened on Monero. Could you bribe some pools? Could you get some collusion at the pool level? Could you actually have a compromise to the chain because it has some flaws in the design, notably on the consensus mechanism? I sure hope that one of the things he's thinking about on the consensus side of things is having blocks be made by the actual, finders of the mathematical proof that are needed to make the next block on Bitcoin. To me, that would be a big change to the consensus mechanism that would go a long way towards making this much more secure, because then we wouldn't have to keep worrying about whether at some point we have collusion and these pools have decided that it's in their best interest to try to make a lot of money shorting Bitcoin and just destroying the entire ecosystem rather than continuing to be altruistic and mine regularly. So if this is part of what's being considered here, even trailing emissions with some amount of inflation, now we're talking. I think that this is the kind of stuff that if Bitcoin starts to adopt these changes, it's a new renaissance of building and implementing stuff on Bitcoin.
Do you know if that is what this BIP 54 is this what BIP 54 is proposing?
Let me look up BIP 54 real quick and see what I can drum up on it. Hold on.
And it's interesting that you bring up the consensus concerns, especially in the wake of Cubic and Monero and the bribing of the pools that occurred, or the bribing of its of the miners in that pool. I would say that part of opening up this ossification or breaking the ossification barrier on Bitcoin might be addressing something like a consensus cleanup before going on to making changes to the scripting. And I do think that the trailing emissions, that will be the last and maybe the greatest fight that occurs. If it is ever to happen.
All right. Okay, so I found BIP 54. I think what this is it's just like a roll up of the stuff that he's talking about here. Soft fork stuff, cleaning up some consensus things. So this seems to be what Luke's particularly talking about in what he's saying he wants to support. But I think it's been in the works for a little while now, because if you look at some of these prices, these are definitely placing BIP 54 as something that's been around for a while. I'm not sure if this was already adopted or not. It looks like something that's already happened. So maybe he's alluding back to it.
I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if this was adopted, but it certainly has been proposed quite a while ago.
Well, regardless, I do think you're right about. I do think you make a great point with regards to concerns about the consensus security being addressed before scripts. Do you agree that the last of the battles to be fought will be the trailing emissions? I mean, you sort of mentioned that offhandedly, but I see the greatest pushback from the Bitcoin community coming with regards to any sort of change to the supply in the future of possible Bitcoin being extended past 21 million.
I think this is a little bit better right above it. So this was created April. Looks like largely cleanups of other things. This might be interesting to go through just at all. I think that might be a follow-up to this. There's a bit more here. I hadn't really intended that we'd get into going into the details of BIP 54, but I should have anticipated that. Yeah, I think it's something to look into. There's the details. I'll put it in the show notes, but I'm not sure I'm fully prepared to dissect this live in situ. But yeah, this is relatively recent, so I'm not sure if this was reintroduced or what's happened, but there was certainly some discussion about the same topic some time ago.
Well, we'll save it for a future episode. Going back to trailing emissions. Sorry, I can't let it go. What do you think about the possibility of the trailing emissions to be added in the future?
Even if people are really excited about there being a specific number of Bitcoin, the 21 million gets thrown around a lot. There is a substantial number of coins that have been completely lost for all time. So we're not even near 21 million of what could ever be truly in circulation or that you could ever put your hands on. So if we had some small amount of inflation over some period of time, it really wouldn't even appreciably change the real number of like how many Bitcoin are there in the world, because the Satoshi coins are probably irretrievably lost. That's something in the millions. There's something in the millions of coins that people have speculated were lost because in the early days people were careless with them. So I really don't see some amount of inflation or some trailing emissions as really having that big of an effect on the total supply. So I would personally be in favor of trailing emissions. I don't think that particularly matters. And, some small amount of inflation isn't going to appreciably change the, disposition of what Bitcoin looks like. If it means we have built-in security for the chain, rewards for miners, that with a minor consensus change to having the miners actually produce the blocks would go a long way towards the long-term health and security of Bitcoin. So I'd say do it.
I think bringing up when you open that conversation, bringing up the lost Bitcoin, the Barnes and Noble card that used to get sort of effect. My grandparents used to give me a Barnes and Noble card to go buy a book every year, and I would just lose the card by the time I ever made it to Barnes and Noble. Great for Barnes and Noble. But when there's no central entity behind Bitcoin, the network it is maybe in some way harmed overall by those lost Bitcoin, lost wallets, holders of wallets who've passed on and don't pass on that seed phrase, or people don't understand how to get a hold of it, even maybe lost devices. But I still think that is going to be a very, very hard row to hoe, a case to make with users of Bitcoin.
I just don't see it that way, because we've already mined out what 90 something percent of all Bitcoin have already been created. So if we even stayed with the current set that we've got, it would take so long to generate anywhere near those millions of Bitcoin that were irretrievably lost. I just can't imagine that it would be that big of an issue. You could vote this through and the whole 21 million narrative doesn't even change. Like, let's say you made it to 22 million, like said, allocate another million for the next 12 years or something like that. The current schedule we're on, even if we were to stick with the halving we've got, it doesn't mean that you'd appreciably change the number of Bitcoin that exist. And this is one of the weird quirks of how the Doge token works, because that thing had such incredible inflation that everybody kind of poo-pooed it at the beginning. But after you've had a substantive amount of time go by, that generation of coins is a drop in the bucket what's already been generated. So if it's managed to find some value, the inflation starts to mean less over time. It's at the beginning that it's just so hard to swallow. I think it's one of the reasons why coins that have this tremendous amount of generation of coins in the beginning that emit something like 85 to 90% of their coins in the first few years of life. It's such a hard way to have it find any value.
There's a distinction between people who are holding Bitcoin or hodling Bitcoin and those who are mining and contributing to the consensus security, and they're the ones who get to vote. So in thinking about that difference between the participants in the Bitcoin system, maybe it is more likely than I've sort of thought about offhand with regards to the addition of trailing emissions. I don't know. I would imagine there's going to be some pushback from just the pure hodlers of the Bitcoin, though, because I picture them as having. Well, I know that there's this narrative about Bitcoin as gold. The attraction with gold is sort of the fixed nature of it, and there are these people who
Gold
are
has
sitting.
gold has the same property. We
It's
do have
true.
gold mines. We do rip gold out of the ground. It starts to have less meaning once you've ripped a certain amount of gold out of the ground. I mean, certainly some asteroid, coming near us and being pure gold and us being able to harvest that and throw it back on the earth would change the dynamic substantively. But the amount of gold that we're able to extract out is sort of priced into the market. I would expect that would be the same thing with Bitcoin. As right now we're pricing in that there are a certain amount of coins that are being produced. There's a certain amount of value that's being absorbed, and it pales in comparison to the total amount of value that already exists and is stored away inside of the Bitcoin infrastructure already. And this is maybe another thing to look at is what are the top companies that are holding Bitcoin? How much are they holding, and what is the ecosystem doing as far as new entrants to store value? I'd say it probably doesn't matter that much unless it's a massive amount, or if we had a supply change of something like 10 to 20%, that would price in. But if it's something like we're increasing the supply by 0.03% every year, it's not enough to make it any kind of difference.
I think monies are separated. I think money is separated from finance by an expanding supply, and I think that's the actual distinction between money and financial instruments. So I do hope that they're able to cross that hurdle and add some sort of trailing emissions. The fear that those who liken gold to being some sort of fixed asset, silver, whatever it may be, um, is with regards to the exponential growth in the addition to the supply. I looked this morning at the United States national debt, and I noticed that we were at now 37.5 trillion, and we just crossed 37 trillion a couple of months ago. Unbelievable that it is expanding so quickly now.
Well, so
Um,
by comparison, if you had minor, like tiny, minuscule inflation on Bitcoin, it wouldn't even be close to what the rest of the world is used to with fiat. So if it made a minor step in that direction to allow for the long-term security and viability of Bitcoin, I think it's a relatively minor trade. And like I said, unless we had some massive proposal for some massive increase, the 21 million narrative still holds, because you could just say, well, so many coins have been lost. This is just the network allowing for the issuance of some of those coins. I mean, yes, Satoshi could still show up someday and move 1 million coins. But I doubt it.
well, I think also having just the fixed inflation rate will also be both an improvement on what we see occurring with fiat currencies in the real world, and also an improvement on the fixed supply that we currently see. Um, I don't have anything else more. I don't know if you had any other aspects of the ossification of Bitcoin before we close up.
I think it's a good place to stop. So be watching for some things happening. I'd say I expect some imminent movement in this direction with this camp coming around to this way of thinking. That to me is a sea change. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we start to see some things flowing into Bitcoin, and we start to see 2026 being the year that Bitcoin takes off in earnest as far as builders getting really excited about building and putting a lot more infrastructure on top of Bitcoin. And we'll see you next time on FOMO.